Ndajiwo. I'm a research consultant with the Tax Justice Network. This is a paper written by myself, Marcus Mainzer, Jakiti, and Rachel Poyer. There's been a lot of discussions on tax incentive recently. From the first day of this conference, you can tell how complicated and yet how important the concept, the issue of tax incentives are, particularly in developing countries. We've realized that in all these discussions, like I said, there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of lumping of the issue, which may sort of undermine the efficiency of the efforts that are supposed to be carried out towards this issue. This is my outline. Recently, I was teaching at the International Tax Justice Academy, and I put up this slide. And the question I asked the audience was, do they mean the same thing? Do all these phrases, do they mean the same thing? Are they different? I got mixed answers. Some people said, yeah, it all means the same thing. Some said no. Some said yes, with a but, yes, however, it might mean different things. And it's the crux of the piece, one of the motivations of this paper, because tax breaks may mean different thing from tax waivers. Some people might think it's the same thing. This may have an effect on the way you sort of analyze. So for us at the TJN, what we're trying to do is create some matrices, in the sense that whenever researchers, policymakers, and the civil society organizations intend to take work on tax incentives, are able to have the sort of tools to analyze these tax incentives in such a way that they understand the differences, the different types of tax incentives, the different implications of these incentives, and different implications based on the jurisdictions that these incentives are being granted. We all know the main idea behind granting tax incentives is to attract foreign direct investment, corporate tax incentives. Research has shown that over the past 30 years, CIT rates have been falling. And particularly for our kind of countries, African countries, developing countries, tax holidays have been on the increase. And this has led to organizations such as the TJNA, ActionAid, to come out with campaigns and researches to say that, we need to do something about this. Yet, many jurisdictions continue to grant these incentives. So what is the problem? Like I said, there's a whole lumping of the issue together. There's a challenge of definitions and the sort of criteria and even data that data that is organized in such a way that it's easy to compare these tax incentives, to be able to understand the different implications for different jurisdictions. So what we're trying to find out is, how can we sort of define tax incentives and be able to efficiently and sort of effectively compare these tax incentives across different jurisdictions for different purposes, for looking at spillover effects, the harmfulness of these tax incentives, amongst other things. And also, more importantly, how do we go about finding this data on tax incentives? So basically what we try to achieve at the end of the day is come up with some matrices that will enable, like I said, CSOs, policymakers, and researchers to sort of use these tools to analyze these tax incentives, be able to understand the different implications, whether or not they're harmful, whether they're useful at all, and be able to compare across different jurisdictions and for policy making purposes. Also, this paper is part of a broader work on the Corporate Tax Haven Index that Marcus explained yesterday, to which we have a workshop tomorrow. If you're still around, we still invite people to indicate their interest. There's a Corporate Tax Haven the Corporate Tax Haven Index has 20 indicators, and this paper is only about, there's 2 indicators of which shows you the sort of work that is required for the corporate tax haven index. We anchored our work based on a very interesting IMF study because we realized that, like I said, there's a whole lumping of the issue, and without really digging into the issue and sort of disaggregating them, you may not be able to sort of, you probably come up with policy recommendations that just scratch the surface because you're unable to sort of differentiate between them. So first thing you have to put at the back of your mind is that you have two broad categories of tax incentives: the profit-based tax incentives and the cost-based tax incentives. And based on our working terminology, and which we anchored on the IMF study, the profit-based tax incentives seem to be more harmful than the cost-based tax incentives. Reason, because the profit-based tax incentives, an example, which is the tax holiday, are usually granted for investment projects that otherwise even happen, even whether or not you grant those tax incentives. But then the cost-based tax incentives, the likes of depreciation allowance, capital allowance, these are real stuff. These are costs incurred by businesses. This actually encourages businesses to invest. But not just some phantom incentive, whether it works or it doesn't work, you just grant a blanket. So, just come invest in my country and I give you 5 years tax holiday, 10 years tax holiday. So, based on the IMF, and we also believe, agree with this assumption that the cost-based tax incentives are less harmful than the profit-based tax incentives. Another category that you should put at the back of your mind is some incentives are time-bound, and some are not time-bound, and they may have also different implications. Some tax incentives are geographically confined. For example, in Kenya, you can find some tax incentives based in Mombasa. Some apply to the whole jurisdiction, to the whole country. So it's also important to understand this and put it at the back of your mind when you're trying to analyze tax incentives for jurisdictions, across different jurisdictions, comparing between different jurisdictions. Also important to note is that there are tax incentives that are full exemptions. You have, say, for example, in Kenya, you have 30% CIT rate. You say, if you're doing so, then we give you a full tax exemption. You don't pay any amount, full exemption. Or they could say, for this business or for that particular activity, you pay 10% instead of 30%. We also believe that there's a difference in because you agree with me, logically, just looking at the numbers, it's better to have some taxes than have no taxes at all. And also, there are other implications for the full tax exemption may be because it may not even be necessary for the multinationals to even submit a return, which will bring about a whole lot of risk. Further considerations, we have 15 countries that we selected for this pilot study. The tax incentives are limited to corporate income taxes. And what we realize is for most jurisdictions, corporate income taxes and capital gains taxes are treated together. For some jurisdictions, they're different, but at the end of the day, you find that they come from the same base anyway. So we're lumping them together. And also that the tax incentives we're working on are those that are accessible by large multinationals or their subsidiaries. Also, our choice for the 15 countries based on these criteria. First of all, major misalignment jurisdictions, and you can read more about it from the wonderful paper by Alex Kovaman-Pereyansky. Secondly, it's because this research it's part of a broader research under the COFAS program, which you can find on our website if you want to read, targeted at EU and EU-related entities. And also because of the effectiveness of the methodology and also the sort of focus on African countries, we selected 5 African countries based on the largest inward FDI. And all these countries are actually represented in the Financial Secrecy Index work, and we did this just so that we can find synergies between data and see if there's some sort of triangulation also between this research. So these are the 15 jurisdictions. So the EU and the EU-related countries here, and then the African countries here. On definition of tax incentives, which we believe is one of the most important issues to consider, when we searched through the literature, we found some, but here I just brought up three. One from an international organization, another from a researcher, from an academic, and then the third one from a civil society. And these are the actors that actually work on this issue. So from the definitions, you can see some similarities. You see these phrases, but also you would notice that there are a few nuances. And from this, we were able, it inspired our own definition, even though our definition is limited to the corporate tax haven index for this particular research. And this is our definition, and highlighting that the multinational companies, the special tax treatment granted to them enables them to pay less taxes than what is usually found in the general tax provision of the jurisdictions. So, like I said earlier, we think it's very important to be able to classify and categorize the tax incentives, because we believe they have different implications, and some may be harmful, some may be less harmful. So for researchers, policymakers, and the civil society organizations, we think it's important to understand that first, the broad category, there are profit-based tax incentives and cost-based tax incentives. And that, like I said, some are geographically confined, some are not. Some are partial tax exemptions, some are full tax exemptions. And the example of the partial geographically constrained incentives would be tax holidays. Sometimes you find that, let's say, in a particular place, there's a special economic zone or an export processing zone. So it's important to have this at the back of your mind. And you can see examples of the profit-based tax incentives. You have tax waivers, tax breaks. An example of the cost-based tax incentives, tax credit, tax refunds, tax deductions, capital allowance, depreciation rules, investment credits. You can read more from the paper. This is just put it in a table for you to be able to, for simpler assimilation. So, like I said, this paper deals with two indicators from the corporate tax haven index work, and this is one of the measures that we developed, the broad exemptions. The broad exemptions is not these are sort of tax incentives that may be granted to a particular sector of the economy, to particular types of activity, to particular so say, for example, startup companies or investment funds. And then from these matrix, you can see that you can easily put it, and this is useful for both qualitative and quantitative research. And I'll give an example of what we're doing, which is sort of a mixed. We're doing a quantitative study, and then you can see that here you have the sort of the type of tax, CIT or CGT, but eventually it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make any difference if you're doing the calculation, but it's just to give you an idea of what it is. And from there also, for research purposes, you can tell if there are differences of whether they grant more CGT or CIT in particular, or if there's any difference. But most importantly, for the quantitative part, you can see that you can either put the reduction concession if it's full or if it's partial. And for us, the score we're giving for the full exemption is more than the score for the partial exemption, because we believe they have different implications and the harmfulness level are different. For what we're doing currently, we give a 20 score for full exemption and the 10 score for partial exemption, and a 0 for no exemption at all. So you can see from this the sort of activities and types of income, the economic sector, and whichever doesn't fit in this is not clear, but is that we regard as a tax incentive that is close to it, we put it as other preferential regimes. So you can look at this again, and if you have any comments on how to improve that, it's welcome. So this is the other matrix on the tax holidays, the economic zones, and I put an example of Kenya because Kenya is part of our study. So you can see here that there's a temporary and the permanent type of tax incentives, like I mentioned earlier. So this matrix enables you, from just a picture, you can really easily tell the sort of tax incentives, and you'll be able to analyze better the sort of different tax incentives. And if you have it at the back of your mind that you're working with an assumption of which is more harmful or which is less harmful, you can easily tell how a jurisdiction is tax incentives is structured. If it's very harmful, if it's least harmful. Here you can see that there's a 10-year tax holiday, and you remember what I said about the profit-based tax incentive. This is a profit-based tax incentive for 10 years. So you can see, so having this, the ordinary tax rate is 30%, but then they're not paying. The 10-year tax holiday in this export processing zone for enterprises is zero, which means all the businesses that operate in that particular EPZ will not be paying any taxes. It's full exemption. We also have the partial exemption. You can see 10% CIT for special economic zones. So this is just to really enable you carry out your analysis better when you're doing research, because the thing is, tax incentives can be very, very complex. From the presentation of on the first day, by which Mark Mansour chaired, you can see, and even from the responses from the audience, there were a lot of discussions going on. But and we believe that being able to analyze them with these matrices will actually help make our work a bit more efficient and even effective. On the sources of data, which we believe is also very important, where do you find data on tax incentives? So we looked at international organizations, the national government portals, the revenue authorities, the ministries of finance, even some investment centers established by governments, also civil society organizations and other private databases. And for international organizations, their raw data are not public. They don't make public their raw data. Some just do some econometric analysis, and you see in some of their papers. So you can, cite them, but not so very useful for deeper analysis. The country coverage, quite known. Comparability, there's no data for you to work on that you can easily compare between different jurisdictions. And robustness, because there's no data, we can't really tell. The timeliness of how they update the papers, we can't really tell. Accessibility, verification, not so useful because data is not readily available. For national level government portals, the likes of, say, the revenue authorities, ministries of finance, they are specific. You can find different portals for a different country. Say, for example, in Kenya, you find that the KRA has some information on tax incentives. The Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Finance will also have some information on tax incentives. However, because it's a single country, it's a single country. There's no the information is for that country alone. There's no comparability. And what we also found that the government portals were not very detailed, not so very well organized. And then the timeliness of how they update it, we really cannot tell. And also on accessibility and sort of verification, I think it depends. It will depend on the agencies. Some agencies are very difficult to penetrate, so some are easy. So it depends on the particular agency. On the CSOs, we made an example of the recent aid scorecard approach. We realized there's a country coverage based on the CSOs that we looked at. They were very low, about less than 10 countries. Comparability would be maybe low to medium. I should fix that since this is low, definitely should be low to medium. And robustness, we can really tell. The timeliness of updating the data, because most of them come out of the research papers, so it's usually one-off. So when they publish a paper, and then that's it, unless they do a follow-up research, it's usually a one-off thing. Also on accessibility replication, it depends on which CSO. The one that we found most interesting and surprisingly most helpful, not surprisingly, because I mean, these private organizations make a lot of money from data, and they have clients, so they provide the information. IBFD is one of them, BNA, the PwC, and the KPMGs, where we found more data on tax incentives actually. And they have, they have a high country coverage. For example, IBFD has over 200 jurisdictions. I was in IBFD for like a month, and trust me, they have information. On the comparability is high, obviously, because they have a lot of jurisdictions covered. Robustness, medium, I would say, maybe medium to high, considering what we have. On the timeliness of the update, medium to high, IBFD, we know they do a lot, they update their data. PwC also does a lot of updates, maybe I think biannually or annually. But then on accessibility, it's sort of mixed. For some, for example, for PwC, it's out there, the PwC World Tax Summaries. You can see the information and tax incentives of different jurisdictions. But for the IBFD, which we believe is a bit more detailed, it's very difficult to access, very expensive. You pay thousands of dollars if you want to access that information. So as researchers, policymakers, and civil society organizations, you put all this at the back of your mind when you want to go about researching on this issue, how you get it, how easy it is, how much you need to spend, and what have you. So this is just this is an example of how we were collecting the data for different jurisdictions. We have 15. This is just one country out of the 15 in our paper. You can look at the paper and see others. You can see how we just did a table based on. You can see the sources we used here. This is Tanzania. Looked at IBFD, different survey, two different surveys, and the Tanzania Revenue Authority, PwC, KPMG. So from all these sources, we were able to get this, and some you will find that in some sources you will find some incentives. So they were quite helpful, and this is all we were able to get from these sources. So, what did we find when we compiled all these tax incentives, looking at EU-dependent, EU and EU-related entities, jurisdictions, and the African countries? We found that the average number of incentives granted by the African group was 5.6, even though the African countries were 5, and then the EU countries were 10, which means that one African countries were granting 2 times the incentives of EU or EU-related countries. And then remember what I said about the profit-based tax incentives being more harmful. Now this is something interesting. Look at the averages. Even though there are 5 African countries in the sample, you see that the average for granting the profit-based tax incentives are higher than the 10 EU and EU-dependent countries. And the cost-based tax incentives, which we believe is least harmful, is the other way around. The African countries granting less, and the EU countries granting more. And then the ratio of cost, looking at the individual groups, the ratio of cost to profit, you see for the African countries, the grant is 1 to 3, and for the EU country group is nearly 1 to 1. For the profit-based incentives granted by the African group, most of them are in the form of tax holidays, special economic zones, and those are for the EU country group. They're usually broad or sectorial, save for Spain and France, who grant some form of tax holidays in Ceuta and Melilla and so Spain, France, yeah. Then for the cost base, usually for the accelerated depreciation cuts across, but the more for R&D, research and development cost deduction for the African country groups, investment cost deduction, tax credits for the EU group. We believe that these matrices that we developed will help civil society organizations, policy makers, and researchers in being able to analyze these incentives, their implications for different jurisdictions, comparing jurisdictions more efficiently or more effectively. Because from what we've done, we've been able to show that the harmfulness, there's a difference between the harmfulness of tax incentives. So if you use these matrices, it will help your research, it will bring out the issues a bit, and then I think it will sort of elevate the discussions from what we're currently doing. Thank you very much.